The war in Syria, are the U.S. and its allies bringing peace or making a bigger mess? Washington and the White House seem more confused than ever when it comes to both domestic and foreign policy, and we catch the fallout. And what does climate change have to do with justice? Stay with us as we talk about all that and more. This is The Last Sip. Welcome to The Last Sip. It's week 2, and we're still here. Like every week since January 2017, it's been another crazy week in the news, but we're here to help orient you with our 3 big takeaways, our 3 big sips as we like to call them, to get you through and to help you figure out how you want to respond. Our first sip this week is Syria. Even though the US, French, and British bombs have stopped falling, the war grinds on in its 7th year. Here to break it all down for us is Jamila Biggio of the Council on Foreign Relations. We'll take a look at the connection between foreign policy and domestic politics with BBC political analyst and author Eric Ham. And because this is Earth Day, our 3rd sip focuses on the often overlooked relationship between climate change, race, and poverty with Caroline Lewis of Miami's The Clio Institute and Thanu Yakupitiage of 350.org. We'll end today with our hot tea segment, which is my chance to cut loose on pop culture. On to the first sip. The US, France, and Great Britain assert that they bombed Syria to stop the use of chemical weapons banned under international law since just after World War I. The war in Syria has caused that nation of almost 20 million to have nearly 1 out of 3 people be displaced or homeless, turned 1 out of 5 into refugees living outside the country, and led to more than 450,000 deaths. That means that everyone in Syria knows someone who has been killed by the conflict. An overwhelming majority of these deaths have been caused by non-chemical weapons that are totally legal under international law. So exactly what message is being sent by US bombs? Here to help me answer that is Jamila Biggio, Senior Fellow in the Women and Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. She served on the National Security Council in the Obama administration. Jamila, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, before we sort of turn to Syria, I wanted to just ask you about North Korea. There's been a lot of movement on North Korea this week, as you know, and I know that it's not your area of expertise sort of geographically, but you have made foreign policy inside a presidential administration. And so I'm wondering if from the outside, does it look like this is a coherent policy? Is this the way that you would normally go about trying to decide how to relate to another country?
First, of course, in any foreign policy conversation, the results are what's critical. So there is news out today that North Korea has signaled that it will suspend its nuclear testing, which is a significant win going into the talks. It's important to have the peace treaty between North and South Korea, but for it to result in the U.S. withdrawing troops from South Korea as a condition is also something that the U.S. should never pursue.
On to Syria. What message are we sending to Assad? Are we saying that it's okay to kill people with certain types of weapons or other? Is our military intervention just that without a strategy for actually how to end the war? I mean, what's your take?
First off, it is important that when a country uses weapons of mass destruction, that we do send a signal that that's wrong and that we won't permit that. But at the same time, we by no means want the message to be that it's okay that a government kills and terrorizes its own citizens so long as it doesn't use chemical weapons. The U.S. really needs to up its response to the Syrian refugees. More than 10 million people have been displaced by the conflict, whether within Syria or to neighboring countries.
Mm-hmm. What has been the disproportionate impact of the war on women and girls?
Right. So first off, we see over 3 million children in Syria and in the refugee camps do not have access to education at all. So this is a lost generation of children that have not had the opportunity to learn, and their entire futures will be affected by it. We see that half of health facilities in the country are destroyed. are shut or not fully functioning. We also see that there's been an increase in gender-based violence, whether this is sexual violence being used to terrorize communities and terrorize women and men, or it's an uptick in domestic violence with the stresses of the conflict. We've also seen an increase in early marriage. So more and more girls are being married off at younger and younger ages with families not able to support them.
I want to thank you for coming in and talking to us. There is much more about Jamila and her work on our website. Go to thelastSIP.org for more information. We're also going to have a web extra with her on the role of women in peacekeeping. So please go to our website and find out about that. And we're also going to have ways in which you can help in Syria directly. So when you go to our website, you can click on how to help, and you can find out more information. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The administration's moves against Syria and various stunts and shows on North Korea don't occur in a vacuum. They occur against the backdrop of the domestic political situation, with a new poll showing President Trump at 38% approval rating, clearly far below what's needed for him to be invited to the cookout. Added to that are his growing legal woes with adult film actress Stormy Daniels, the fallout from his lawyer's office being raided, and ongoing suits claiming, among other things, that he's broken the Constitution's emoluments clause. I had to practice that a few times. And of course, former FBI Chief James Comey published his book and released all his receipts. Memos. The heat is so turned up now, Trump had to bring in his longtime frenemy and sometimes drag artist, Rudy Giuliani, to join his legal team. Here to take us through what it all means is Eric Ham, a BBC political analyst and author of The GOP Civil War Inside the Battle for the Soul of the Republican Party. Eric, thanks for joining us, and I didn't know that political parties had souls. What do you think of these new poll numbers, and what do they signify? I quite frankly never believed the ones that were showing him that he was at 50%, not because he didn't have 50% when he won office, but what do you think about what all this signifies?
Actually, Donald Trump's numbers are static. They've actually been at around 38 to 42% since he got elected to president, since he took the oath of office. And so I think this is where the president is. This is where the president, I think, will be for the duration of his presidency. The question becomes, can he maintain majorities in both the House and Senate with his approval rating at such a historic low point?
You see what's happening in retirements, right? So even when he was supposedly at 50%, people were still saying, you know what, not this year, I'm gonna go collect my check and sit down. If he was at 50%, that's a good number for a president going into an election year. So I think that you're right, that this 30, high 30s that he's in, it's a danger zone, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. All you have to do is just look at the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan himself. We've had a number of chairmen, high-ranking senior members of Congress, and that's actually where the power really lies, is with the most senior members of Congress. And so you have chairmen, senior ranking members in the GOP who are leaving in record numbers.
What do you think is the floor for this presidency? I always remind people all the time that, excuse me, when Nixon resigned office, after he had been impeached, 1 out of 4 people in the United States still supported him, 25%, right? So if that was Nixon's floor, that he still had that level of support even after having been impeached, even after the tapes came out, and Donald Trump is kind of in the mid-30s. Do you think that there's any way that Trump, under certain circumstances, would ever get Nixon territory? Or is he just going to be more popular than Richard Nixon?
Well, we just haven't seen this president's numbers fall below around 35%. And so I think what you're seeing now is, this is his floor, because his base is very ardent. And that's what we see from this president. For example, next Saturday night is the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And we know President Trump will not be at that dinner because, again, to be at that would be seen as a capitulation to the press, which we know he has derided since he came into office. And so, but again, the reason he won't go is because he's placating his base. He's playing to his base. And the president knows that base is all that he has left. And so you will see him not move on issues like DACA and make some of the decisions, even though they may not be smart policy or sound policy, but they sound good to his base.
Well, thank you for your insights on this. I guess we're going to see what it looks like to run a majority of the country with a minority of support and what that type of government looks like rolling forward. So thank you so much for joining us, Eric. And for more information on Eric and his book, please go to our website, thelastsip.org. We'll be right back. Today is Earth Day, and there's no greater issue for us and the planet than climate change. 2017, 2016, and 2015 were the hottest 3 years on record. But a little known thing about climate change is that despite it conjuring images of Leonardo DiCaprio driving a Prius or Al Gore hauling around a PowerPoint, the hardest and fastest impacts of climate change are falling on people of color around the world and in the United States. Just look at the lingering devastation of Hurricanes Katrina, Sandy, Irma, Maria, and Harvey, you name it. Now, those were dramatic events, but here to talk to us about slower moving ones, namely the relationship between gentrification and climate change, is Caroline Lewis, Executive Director of the Clio Institute based in Miami. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, climate change is a reality for all communities in Miami already. Can you tell us what some of those daily realities are, like the sunny day flooding and other things?
Right, so in Miami, Florida, which is a very flat peninsula, the highest ground is about 15 or 16 feet above sea level. So what we have happening in Miami right now with the porous limestone bedrock is saltwater intrusion, eroding coasts. The ocean is actually encroaching, and we have sunny day flooding with the ocean water actually coming up through the drains that are meant to take away storm water and flooding the roads. Unfortunately, there's health concerns about this water because it's high in nutrient value, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. And in what ways is the growing flooding in low-lying areas that are a lot of where wealthy neighborhoods are located, how is that causing certain neighborhoods to shift? What's happening specifically in the Little Haiti neighborhood and why?
So what's happening is those in the low-lying areas are getting accustomed to tidal flooding, which happens 6 to 10 times a year in the spring and in the fall. Those on Miami Beach that have a big tax base are lucky to have the water being pumped out by very expensive pumps.
Wow.
So it's not a problem that much right now. However, you have low-lying areas in less wealthy neighborhoods. They don't have that luxury, and therefore that salt water is there, eroding the base of their cars and causing problem. When you move to Little Haiti and Liberty City, which are predominantly underserved communities, those are in high ground. They were on the railroad tracks and the ridge in Miami-Dade County. Mm-hmm. So that was undesirable land back when. But seeing that they're on high elevations of 14, 15, 16 feet now, there seems to be some predatory takeover by developers of those properties. A lot of it is anecdotal right now. Developers are claiming that they're not looking at elevation levels for their purchases. But mapping the recent purchases, it's showing a tremendous correlation between high ground and underserved areas and predatory developers trying to buy up that land.
What are some of the answers that you're looking for and piloting? Because I'm sure that what is experiencing there is going to be experienced elsewhere. That is to say, places that are in lower lying areas become undesirable. Places that are higher and may once upon a time been undesirable are now where people want to live. What are you doing to counteract that, and how could it be a model for other places?
Well, what we're doing is trying to work with the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County to make sure that those vulnerable populations that fall behind on taxes aren't feeling pressured to sell prematurely or evicted by landlords so that they can redevelop the land. We're trying to create safety nets. People without safety nets is what we're doing. So the idea that Hurricane Irma did not even hit us, but we had tremendous damage. People went several days without work. The people living on the high ground now they, in rental properties or in owned properties, sort of feel the pressure. The public record indicates to developers who is in foreclosure, who's falling behind on taxes, and they feel pretty vulnerable in terms of being coerced to move out.
Wow. Well, thank you for coming on and letting us know about this issue, actually this intersection of gentrification and climate change, which isn't apparent but does make sense in the way that you lay it out, and also just highlighting the ways in which we can counteract that, but specifically by trying to provide a safety net and letting people know what their rights are. Letting people know what their rights are as renters, as people in places that don't have information, just using that as a weapon to be able to counteract and maintain their homes in the face of this pressure. Thank you, Caroline, for taking the time to join us today and to talk about the ways in which we can counteract this intersection between gentrification and climate change. For more information about Caroline, the Clio Institute, and climate change, please visit us at thelastSIP.org and click on How to Help. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Last Sip. We're talking about climate change's effect on our communities. As fossil fuels and the resulting carbon pollution are the identified cause of climate change, what are some of the big answers to how we can tackle the climate crisis? One response, championed by 350.org and other environmental organizations, is to call for government pension and private investment funds to divest from fossil fuel companies. Here to talk about why is Thanu Yakupitiage, head of U.S. communications at 350.org. Now, in full disclosure, Thanu and I worked on a project to highlight the ongoing effects of Hurricane Sandy on communities of color, so we just have to be transparent about that. Thanks for joining us, first of all. Thanu, fossil fuel companies make up 4 out of the 5 largest companies in the world. And if you add fossil reliant companies, specifically car companies, it's 6 out of the 10 largest companies in the world. Given this power, what can divestment do? What hope can we have to tackle the climate crisis through divestment, given just their disproportionate impact and power in the world through the economy and economic means?
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, thank you for having me. Divestment, I think, is a really critical response to a lot of social and economic problems. And in regards to climate change, divestment is the way in which we can take money out of corporations that are fueling the climate crisis, who have actively lied about the climate crisis for decades. So, for example, there have been reports from that both Exxon and Shell knew about climate change, and they've been hiding this for over 30 years. And regardless of the fact that they knew what some of the impacts would be, they still decided that, digging for fossil fuels was the way to go. Only 2 weeks ago, Shell, there was a report about Shell out saying that as recent as 1998, they predicted that by 2010, 2012, there would be a major climate catastrophe such as Hurricane Sandy, and they actually predicted what would happen in New York. And so what we're really trying to do with divestment is really shift resources away from corporations and companies and to communities and to community solutions.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, why do you think that divestment is the answer for communities of color in the U.S. and around the world? Because there's so many different ways that they have to respond. There has to be, quote, managed retreat, which means to flee and find new places. There are a full range of responses that are possible. So why do you think that it's an answer specifically for the communities that you discussed?
Yeah, well, across the world, when there are climate impacts, the people most impacted in the US are communities of color. Around the world are vulnerable people and poor communities. And so when corporations like this are basically fueling the climate crisis, and yet the people who have the least to do with the problem, who have impacted it the least, are the ones being who are suffering, it actually goes to show that like by diverting resources to those communities, we're actually helping to protect and resource up communities that actually had nothing to do with the problem. So New York City, for example, in January, New York City divested its pension funds, a total of $5 billion, which is significant. New York City, it becomes like basically the first major city in the US to divest from fossil fuels, and they're suing 5 of the major fossil fuel companies for climate change damages, specifically because of the damages caused by Hurricane Sandy. It was actually $65 billion in damages, and the majority of those damages were to places like the Rockaways, to Queens, that were places where working class, communities of color, and Black communities live.
So it is actually taking, making fossil fuel companies pay in a way in this to strengthen these communities. What are those campaigns that actually work in terms of getting localities and companies to hold? I think it's something like 450 organizations have been have agreed to divest, right? So what does it look like when that happens?
It's actually 800 institutions across the world now that have divested.
Oh, wow.
And divestment is close to $6 trillion now.
Wow, okay.
So, and it's a slow build. That's the thing about divestment, is that it's a very slow build. Here in the US, it started on universities. It was very much like college students who were pushing for divestment.
Yeah, like South Africa.
Exactly,
Yeah.
pushing for their universities to divest, faith institutions pushing for their institutions to divest, museums. And so when you see the slow build, what we saw in January with New York City was momentous for divestment campaigns, because it really shows that a slow build works. And it seems initially like, oh, well, how are they going to do this? But if you really add up the numbers, it's over $6 trillion in divestment. And it's actually shifting the ways in which fossil fuel companies are thinking about their practices. They're actually being held accountable. And the truth is, they're afraid. Exxon and Shell are now basically being investigated by attorney generals across the country and the world. There are reports coming out showing that Exxon and Shell and other corporations actually knew about the impact of climate change 30 years ago, and yet knowing that knowledge, withholding the realities of climate change, still chose to burn fossil fuels and to sell fossil fuels. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of cities are now saying that, well, you know, climate change is impacting us, they're impacting the poorest of our communities, and we need to hold those accountable, because these companies said that burning fossil fuels wasn't going to impact anything. And so these companies, as well as governments, they've lied to communities, and now communities are bearing the brunt. So the hope of divestment, I think, lies in really a major cultural, political, and social shift.
Well, thank you so much for coming and explaining what divestment is, how it actually can be an effective tool when used right, because they seem like such a behemoth, but there are answers and there's hope. So for more, please go to our website, thelaststep.org, and click on how to help. You can find out more about divestment there and more about all of the ways in which you can get involved on the issue of climate change. Thanu, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to The Last Sip. It's been another big week for pop culture. As if Baychella wasn't enough, Baychella 2 will be rolled out to drive us further Bay crazy still. 4 Black people, the highest number ever in a single year, were awarded Pulitzer Prizes, including Kendrick Lamar for Damn. Pulitzers were also awarded to those at the New York Times for their #MeToo reporting. Cardi B got political, even grabbing the attention of Bernie Sanders talking about Social Security. And Friday was 420 Day, so I hope no one tried to pass the duchy to Jeff Sessions on the left-hand side. But the biggest pop culture moves of the week concerned death, one of a person, the other of a show. The person was Barbara Bush, the 92-year-old matriarch of the Bush family. She inspired some women and enraged others with her emphasis on domestic life, knocks on the careers of Hillary Clinton and Anita Hill, championing of literacy programs for people of color, and supporting the presidential ambitions of both her husband and son. Now, the Women's March marked her death by sending out a tweet to wish her rest in peace and power. Given the tweet storm that erupted from women in the wake of that, it just goes to show you that America is so twisted right now that we can't even agree on death. But it's the death of a program that is the biggest development in pop culture. That program is none other than Shonda Rhimes' Scandal. When that program hit with a Black woman in charge, donning a Birkin bag on her arm, a glass of red wine in one hand, and a direct phone line to everybody with any power in the other, it sent a jolt through all women. especially women of color. That had not happened in 40 years. In so many ways, it matched our reality. We tend to hold everyone else together with intelligence and bravery, even as we barely manage to hold it together ourselves. And this is the point. It deliberately cast a black woman as the absolute hero of the story, literally putting her in a white hat in an attempt to cancel out 100 years of racism in TV and film where only white men were allowed to wear one, often in opposition to people of color cast as villains. A black woman was cast as the best that America has to offer. I just hope that it doesn't take decades for us to see that again, because that would truly be a scandal. Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for joining us on The Last Sip. We'll see you soon.